The crystalline spires of Xerion Prime gleamed under the twin suns, their surfaces reflecting the peaceful morning light across the sprawling city below. Ambassador Keflar adjusted her ceremonial robes as she walked through the Grand Council chambers, her four arms moving in the traditional greeting gestures that had maintained peace across 17 star systems for over 3 centuries. The Xerion Collective had always prided itself on diplomacy, on finding solutions through negotiation rather than violence. That philosophy was about to be tested in ways they never imagined. The first warning came from the Outer Rim sensors, a cascade of urgent signals that made the monitoring stations across the planet buzz with activity. Keflar received the alert through her neural implant while reviewing trade agreements with the Valders Confederation. The message was simple, terrifying, and completely unexpected. Unknown vessels approaching at impossible speeds, trajectory set for Xerion Prime. She rushed to the observation deck, her elongated legs carrying her swiftly through corridors lined with historical murals depicting centuries of peaceful coexistence. The view from the observation deck showed nothing unusual at first, just the familiar dance of orbital platforms and shipping lanes that kept their civilization running smoothly. Then, the first ships appeared. They emerged from hyperspace like daggers cutting through reality itself. The vessels were unlike anything in the collective databases, their hulls a matte black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. No communication preceded their arrival, no hails requesting permission to enter Xerion space. They simply appeared and began moving toward the planet with mechanical precision. Keflar activated the emergency protocols, her fingers dancing across holographic interfaces as she tried to establish communication with the approaching fleet. Standard diplomatic channels yielded nothing but static. Universal translator matrices found no recognizable linguistic patterns. Even the most basic mathematical sequences, the foundation of first contact procedures developed over millennia, received no response. The silence was more terrifying than any threat could have been. Within hours, the true horror became apparent. The unknown fleet wasn't just ignoring communication attempts. They were actively jamming all signals from Xerion Prime. Orbital defense platforms went dark one by one, their crews reporting system failures across the board. It wasn't destruction, it was something far more insidious. The invaders were somehow turning their own technology against them. Keflar watched helplessly as the first landing ships descended through the atmosphere like black rain. They touched down in perfect formations across the major population centers, disgorging troops that moved with inhuman coordination. The beings that emerged defied easy description. They stood roughly humanoid in shape, but moved with a fluid grace that spoke of extensive cybernetic enhancement. Their faces were hidden behind featureless masks, and they carried weapons that seemed to bend light around their barrels. The Xerion Defense Forces were the finest peacekeepers in the galaxy, trained in non-lethal crowd control and equipped with the most advanced stunning technologies available. They had maintained order across 17 worlds for 3 centuries without firing a single lethal shot. Against these invaders, their weapons proved completely ineffective. The stunning beams passed harmlessly through the attacker's armor. Containment fields collapsed the moment they made contact with the strange black material of their suits. Even the sonic disruptors, designed to incapacitate any known biological nervous system, had no effect whatsoever. The invaders didn't even slow down as the defenders threw everything they had at them. What followed could barely be called a battle. It was more like a systematic dismantling of everything the Xerion Collective had built. The invaders moved through the cities with surgical precision, capturing key infrastructure points and herding civilians into designated areas. They showed no interest in negotiation, no response to surrender attempts, no mercy for those who couldn't keep up with their demands. Keflar found herself trapped in the Grand Council chambers as the building was surrounded. Through the massive windows, she could see the invaders working with mechanical efficiency to set up what appeared to be processing stations in the central plaza. Long lines of her people were being organized into groups, sorted by some criteria she couldn't understand. The technology the invaders used was beyond anything in the collective's databases. Energy signatures that made no sense, materials that shouldn't exist, and coordination patterns that suggested either a hive mind or communication methods operating faster than light itself. Every attempt to analyze their equipment resulted in sensor overloads or complete system failures. As night fell across Zirian Prime, the magnitude of the disaster became clear. 7 major cities had fallen within hours. Orbital defense networks were completely compromised. The fleet that had taken centuries to build was either captured or neutralized. Worse still, similar reports were coming in from the other 16 worlds of the collective. The attack was simultaneous, coordinated across impossible distances, and absolutely devastating in its efficiency. In the darkened council chambers, surrounded by the art and culture of a peaceful civilization that had just learned the true meaning of helplessness, Kethlar made a decision that went against everything her people believed in. She activated the emergency beacon that connected directly to the Galactic Communication Network, bypassing local systems that had been compromised. Her message was brief, desperate, and addressed to anyone who might be listening across the galaxy. This is Ambassador Kethlar of the Zirian Collective. We are under attack by unknown forces. Our defenses have failed. Our weapons are ineffective. Our people are being captured and processed for unknown purposes. We have maintained peace for over 3 centuries, but we cannot defend ourselves against this threat. We formally request military assistance from any civilization capable of providing it. We are prepared to offer anything in exchange for help. Please, if anyone is receiving this transmission, we are running out of time. The message propagated across the galactic network, bouncing through relay stations and communication hubs across dozens of star systems. Most civilizations that received it filed it away as yet another regional conflict, the kind of minor disruption that occasionally required peacekeeping intervention from the Galactic Council. The Zirian Collective had always been peaceful, which meant they had few allies with any real military capability. Most civilizations dismissed the plea or decided it wasn't their problem. But there was one species that had been monitoring galactic communications with particular interest, a relatively new addition to the galactic community that most other races regarded with a mixture of curiosity and concern. They called themselves humans, and they had a very different perspective on how to respond to bullies. The human monitoring station on the edge of the Tau Ceti system picked up Kethlar's distress call within hours of its transmission. Lieutenant Sarah Chun was pulling the night shift when a message came through, and she immediately recognized the urgency in the alien ambassador's voice despite the species' differences. She'd heard that tone before, in her grandmother's stories about the old wars back on Earth. Chun forwarded the message up the chain of command, adding her own assessment. Recommend immediate investigation. Signal characteristics suggest genuine distress, not a deception or training exercise. Unknown aggressors with superior technology representing potential threat to galactic stability. The message reached Admiral Marcus Rivera at Terra's Central Command within 6 hours. Rivera was old enough to remember the Unification Wars, when humanity had nearly destroyed itself before finally learning to work together. He'd spent his entire career preparing for the day when humanity might need to defend not just Earth, but the principles that had eventually brought peace to their war-torn species. As he reviewed the tactical data that had been compiled from other sources, Rivera realized this was exactly the kind of situation that humanity had been preparing for. The invaders weren't interested in negotiation or compromise. They were predators, and predators only understood one language. It was a language that humanity had spent millennia learning to speak fluently. Rivera activated Operation Righteous Fury, a rapid deployment protocol that had been developed specifically for humanitarian intervention scenarios. Within 12 hours, the 3rd Expeditionary Marine Division was loading onto transport ships equipped with the latest jump drives. The force included 12,000 Marines, their equipment, and enough firepower to level a small moon if necessary. But firepower was only part of what made the human military effective. The other part was something that most galactic civilizations had never encountered: the absolute refusal to abandon people who had asked for help. It was a trait that had gotten humanity into more trouble than any other species could understand, but it was also what made them uniquely suited to handle situations like this. As the human fleet prepared to jump towards Zirian space, Admiral Rivera addressed his Marines via ship-wide communication. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just received a distress call from a peaceful civilization under attack by unknown hostiles. Intel suggests their attackers are using advanced technology and showing no mercy to civilians. The Zirian Collective has asked for our help, and we're going to give it to them. Remember your training, watch out for each other, and show these bastards why you don't mess with people under human protection." The jump to Zirian space would take 18 hours, even with their fastest ships. Rivera knew that every minute counted, but he also knew that rushing in without proper intelligence would just get his people killed. As the fleet entered hyperspace, human intelligence analysts worked around the clock to piece together what they could from fragmentary reports and long-range sensor data. What they found was disturbing. The attackers weren't just conquering territory, they were harvesting something from the populations they captured. Energy signatures suggested some kind of biological processing, though the exact nature remained unclear. Whatever they were doing, it was happening on an industrial scale across multiple worlds. Meanwhile, on Zirian Prime, Kethlar watched helplessly as her people disappeared into the processing stations. The invaders had been working for 3 days now, their mechanical efficiency never wavering. They showed no signs of fatigue, no pause for rest or sustenance. Whatever they weren't entirely biological. The worst part was the silence. Her people were being taken, but there were no screams, no sounds of struggle. The invaders used some kind of neural suppression field that left their victims conscious, but unable to resist. Families were separated with clinical precision, sorted into different categories that seemed to follow no logic the Zirian could understand. On the 4th day, something changed. The invaders suddenly became more active, their movements taking on an urgency that hadn't been there before. They began accelerating their processing operations, working faster to clear the civilian holding areas. It was as if they were rushing to complete their work before something happened. Kethlar didn't know what had triggered this change in behavior, but she dared to hope that her distress call had reached someone willing to help. The feeling was confirmed when the invaders began deploying additional defensive positions around their landing sites. They were preparing for a fight. High above Zirian Prime, the black ships that had brought such terror to the system suddenly found themselves facing a new development. Long-range sensors detected multiple hyperspace signatures approaching fast. The invader fleet moved to intercept, their formations shifting with the same mechanical precision they had shown throughout the invasion. Then, the human fleet arrived. 12 ships emerged from hyperspace in a formation that spoke of aggressive intent rather than diplomatic contact. The vessels were smaller than the invaders' ships, but they moved with a predatory grace that suggested they were built for one purpose: war. As they approached the Zirian system, they broadcast a message on all frequencies in perfect Zirian dialect. "This is Admiral Rivera of the Terran Expeditionary Force. You have attacked a peaceful civilization that requested our protection. You will cease all hostile activities immediately and withdraw from Zirian space, or we will consider you enemy combatants and respond accordingly. You have 30 seconds to comply." The response was predictable. The invader fleet opened fire with weapons that bent space itself, creating gravitational distortions that should have crushed the human ships instantly. The humans' response was not what anyone expected. Instead of being destroyed, the human ships seemed to dance between the gravitational attacks, their pilots executing maneuvers that defied conventional understanding of physics. Return fire came in the form of projectiles that somehow maintained coherence through hyperspace distortions, striking the invader vessels with kinetic force that their energy shields couldn't deflect. For the first time since the invasion began, the attackers found themselves facing opponents who could actually hurt them. The space battle was brief but decisive. Human tactics, developed through centuries of warfare against each other, proved devastatingly effective against an enemy that had grown accustomed to easy victories. As the last invader ship exploded in a brilliant flash of exotic particles, the human fleet moved into orbit around Zirian Prime. Transport ships launched immediately, their hulls scarred with battle damage, but their cargo bays full of Marines ready to finish what the fleet had started. On the surface, the invaders detected the incoming shuttles and prepared for ground combat. They had processed millions of beings across dozens of worlds without significant resistance. These newcomers would be just another species to harvest. They had no idea what they were about to face. The atmospheric entry of human dropships was unlike anything the defenders or invaders had witnessed. Where most civilizations relied on energy shields and gravity manipulation to achieve gentle landings, the humans came down like meteors, their ships trailing fire and surrounded by what appeared to be controlled explosions. The Zirian, watching from hidden positions, thought the vessels were breaking apart. The invaders prepared to collect wreckage and analyze the failed technology. Both groups were wrong. The explosions were deliberate, designed to create sensor shadows and mask the true number of landing craft descending through Zirian Prime's atmosphere. What appeared to be 6 ships was actually 18, with additional craft using the debris signatures as cover. By the time the invaders realized their mistake, Marines were already on the ground and moving toward their positions. Gunnery Sergeant Maria Santos hit the ground running, her powered armor absorbing impacts that would have shattered bones and liquefied organs in any unprotected human. Around her, 2nd Platoon of Charlie Company deployed with the mechanical precision that came from years of training and multiple combat deployments across human space. But this was their first time fighting for someone else's world, their first time being the cavalry, riding to the rescue. The difference was subtle, but significant. These Marines weren't fighting for territory or resources or political advantage. They were here because someone had asked for help, and that changed everything about how they approached the mission. Santos surveyed the urban battlefield through her helmet's enhanced optics, noting the positions of invader forces and the locations of civilian holding areas. The aliens had set up their processing stations in the central plaza, a decision that made tactical sense for controlling the population, but created vulnerabilities that human infantry could exploit. Her tactical display lit up with target designations as the platoon's forward observers began painting enemy positions. The invaders had superior technology and numerical advantage in this sector, but they had made one critical error. They had positioned themselves in an urban environment against opponents who had spent centuries perfecting urban warfare. The first indication the invaders had that something was wrong came when their perimeter sensors began failing in sequence. Not destroyed, not jammed, simply offline. Human combat engineers had developed techniques for dealing with advanced sensor networks during the corporate wars, and those skills translated well to alien technology. Sometimes the old ways were the best ways. Corporal David Kim moved through the ruins of what had been a Zirian cultural center, his camouflage system adapting to the alien architecture with each step. The technology was impressive, but Kim's real advantage was knowing how to think like prey when hunting predators. The invaders were used to being the most dangerous thing on any battlefield, which made them predictable in ways they didn't understand. He reached his assigned position and began setting up the equipment that would turn this engagement from a firefight into a proper Marine Corps operation. The device he carried looked simple enough, just a metal box with several antennas, but it represented decades of human innovation in electronic warfare. When activated, it would do something the invaders had probably never experienced: turn their own technology against them in real time. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Rachel Torres was leading 1st Platoon through the drainage systems beneath the city. The Zirian had built their infrastructure with typical alien efficiency, creating maintenance tunnels that were perfectly sized for human infiltration. It was almost as if they had designed their city specifically to be liberated by human marines, though Torres doubted they had planned that far ahead. The tunnels brought them directly beneath the main processing station, where thermal imaging revealed hundreds of Xerian civilians in various stages of whatever horrific procedure the invaders used. The lieutenant checked her chronometer and confirmed that all units were in position. In 30 seconds, the nature of this battle would change completely. Above ground, the invaders continued their methodical processing of prisoners, unaware that they were about to experience something that no species in the galaxy had successfully resisted: human marines with a righteous cause and no restraints on their methods. The attack began with Kim's electronic warfare device coming online. Instantly, every piece of invader technology within a kilometer radius began experiencing cascading failures. Their communication systems started broadcasting human rock music at maximum volume. Their weapons targeting systems began displaying what appeared to be human pornography. Most critically, their coordination protocols collapsed as their command network was flooded with viral programs designed specifically to cause chaos. The invaders had never encountered an opponent capable of turning their technological advantage into a liability. Their cybernetics, designed to interface seamlessly with their equipment, suddenly became sources of sensory overload and disorientation. For the first time in their species' history, they experienced something approaching panic. That was when the explosives detonated. Torres and her platoon had spent 20 minutes placing shaped charges throughout the processing station support structure. The resulting explosion was precisely calculated to collapse specific sections while leaving the civilian areas intact. In the span of 3 seconds, the invaders went from controlling a fortified position to being trapped in rubble with their prisoners, suddenly free and very angry. Santos led her platoon through the gap in the invader lines while smoke and dust still filled the air. The aliens' advanced sensors were useless in the chaos, but human marines had trained for this exact scenario in urban combat simulators across half a dozen worlds. They moved through the destruction like they were walking through their own neighborhood. The first direct engagement was brief and one-sided. The invaders' energy weapons were indeed formidable, but they required line-of-sight targeting and were designed for use against opponents using conventional tactics. Human Marines did not use conventional tactics. Private First Class Michael Chun emerged from the smoke directly behind an invader position, his assault rifle chattering as he poured armor-piercing rounds into targets at point-blank range. The aliens' energy shields were designed to deflect directed energy weapons and gravitational attacks, but they had never been tested against chemically propelled projectiles moving at hypersonic velocities. The results were spectacular. Alien armor that had proven invulnerable to Xerian stunners cracked and shattered under the impact of human bullets. Energy shields overloaded as they tried to stop projectiles that carried kinetic energy measured in kilojoules. The invaders discovered that their technology, advanced as it was, had been optimized for fighting a very different type of warfare. Within minutes, the tactical situation reversed completely. The aliens found themselves fighting an enemy that used smoke and noise and confusion as weapons that appeared from unexpected directions and vanished before effective counterattacks could be organized. Worse, their own technology was actively working against them as human electronic warfare specialists maintained constant pressure on their command and control systems. But the real shock came when the invaders tried to retreat to their secondary positions and discovered that those had already been compromised. Human Marines had been moving through the city's infrastructure for hours, using maintenance tunnels and service corridors to position themselves throughout the urban environment. Every fallback position, every escape route, every tactical advantage the invaders thought they possessed had been systematically neutralized. Sergeant First Class Jennifer Park watched through her rifle scope as a group of invaders attempted to reach their landing craft. They moved with the same mechanical precision they had displayed throughout the occupation, but precision was useless when your opponents controlled the entire battlefield. A simple radio call brought artillery fire from the human ships in orbit, turning the aliens' escape route into a crater filled with exotic debris. The artillery strike demonstrated another aspect of human warfare that the invaders hadn't anticipated: integration. Where most species treated space and ground combat as separate domains, humans had spent centuries learning to coordinate operations across multiple environments simultaneously. The fleet in orbit wasn't just transportation. It was an active participant in ground operations. As the urban battle continued, reports came in from across Zirian Prime. Human forces were engaging invader positions throughout the planet, and everywhere the story was the same. The aliens' technological superiority meant nothing against opponents who specialized in fighting dirty and winning ugly. Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez led a squad through the industrial sector, where the invaders had set up what appeared to be massive extraction facilities. The purpose of the equipment was unclear, but the smell of death that hung over the complex left little doubt about its function. Rodriguez had seen genocide before, during the suppression campaigns in human space, and he recognized the signs. His squad's mission was simple: destroy everything and rescue anyone still alive. The simplicity was deceptive. The industrial complex was heavily defended and filled with unknown alien technology. But Rodriguez's Marines had two advantages that no alien species had ever possessed: absolute fury at what they were seeing, and complete willingness to die rather than let it continue. The assault on the complex became the day's hardest fighting. The invaders seemed to understand that losing this facility would be catastrophic, and they defended it with desperate intensity. Energy weapons cut through the air like lethal lightning, and gravitational distortion fields turned sections of the battlefield into zones where physics stopped working normally. Human Marines adapted by doing what they had always done when facing superior firepower. They closed with the enemy and fought hand-to-hand. Powered armor turned ordinary soldiers into walking tanks, and combat drugs eliminated the fear and hesitation that might have slowed them down. When the invaders tried to retreat into their facility, Marines followed them inside and continued to fight in the corridors and processing chambers. What the humans found inside the complex defied description. Rows of extraction tables where Zirian civilians had been systematically processed for some unknown biological component. Storage tanks filled with substances that analysis would later identify as concentrated neural tissue. Equipment designed to keep victims conscious throughout procedures that should have killed them instantly. The discovery triggered something in the Marines that their officers had never seen before, even among veterans of the most brutal campaigns in human history. They didn't just destroy the facility. They annihilated it so completely that forensic teams would later have difficulty determining what it had been used for. No invader in the complex survived to explain their purpose. Similar scenes played out across the planet as human forces uncovered the true scope of the invader operation. This wasn't conquest in any conventional sense. It was harvesting on an industrial scale. Entire populations processed for biological materials that served some unknown purpose in the invader civilization. The revelation changed the nature of the human response. What had begun as a rescue mission became something darker and more personal. Orders came down from Admiral Rivera that quarter was no longer an option. Any invader forces that had participated in the processing operations were to be eliminated with extreme prejudice. Kethlar watched the liberation of her capital city from the damaged council chambers, hardly believing what she was seeing. The beings who called themselves humans moved through the urban environment like they had been born to warfare, appearing wherever they were needed most and vanishing before the invaders could respond effectively. But it wasn't just their tactical skills that amazed her. It was their fury. These aliens had crossed half the galaxy to help a species they had never met before, and they were fighting with an intensity that suggested personal investment in the outcome. When her people emerged from the processing stations, shattered and traumatized, the human Marines treated them with gentle care that seemed impossible from beings who had just slaughtered their way through fortified positions. The contrast was striking. One moment, they were killing machines, tearing through enemy defenses. The next, they were medics and counselors helping traumatized civilians find safety. Kethlar began to understand why these humans had succeeded where her people's peaceful philosophy had failed. They understood that sometimes violence was the only language that bullies comprehended. As night fell across Zirian Prime, the human forces consolidated their positions and prepared for the final phase of operations. Intelligence indicated that the invaders were regrouping for a counterattack, probably coordinated with forces from the other occupied worlds. Admiral Rivera was already preparing for that possibility, but first they had to secure the civilians and ensure that the processing facilities could never be used again. The night brought new horrors as Marines discovered secondary facilities hidden throughout the city. The invaders had been preparing for long-term operations, setting up infrastructure for what appeared to be permanent harvesting operations. Underground laboratories where Zirian children had been subjected to experiments that violated every concept of civilized behavior. Storage areas filled with biological components from dozens of species, suggesting that the Zirian collective was just the latest target in a campaign of systematic genocide. By dawn, the human forces had uncovered evidence of crimes that defied comprehension. The invaders weren't just conquering civilizations, they were farming them for biological resources. The scope of the operation suggested a threat to every sentient species in the galaxy, something that made the current battle just the opening engagement in a much larger war. Lieutenant Colonel James MacArthur, commander of the 3rd Expeditionary Marine Division, stood in the ruins of what had been the main processing facility and tried to process what his forces had discovered. His Marines were hardened veterans who had seen the worst that war could offer, but several had required evacuation after discovering the full extent of the invader operations. The tactical situation on Zirian Prime was secure, but MacArthur knew this was just the beginning. Intelligence reports suggested similar operations on 16 other worlds, each one representing millions of lives that needed to be saved. The human fleet was powerful, but it couldn't be everywhere at once. As if reading his thoughts, his communications officer approached with a priority message from Admiral Rivera. "Sir, we're receiving transmissions from across the galaxy. News of our operations here has spread through the communication networks. Other civilizations are requesting assistance with similar invader forces." MacArthur nodded grimly. "How many worlds?" 43 confirmed, sir. Possibly more. The invader fleet was larger than we initially thought. The colonel looked out across the city where his Marines were still working to rescue survivors and eliminate remaining threats. 43 worlds. Millions, possibly billions of lives hanging in the balance. And the only force in the galaxy capable of stopping this nightmare was a species that most civilizations considered barbaric warmongers. The irony wasn't lost on him. Humanity had spent centuries being lectured by peaceful species about the virtues of diplomacy and nonviolence. Now, those same species were begging for protection from an enemy that only understood force. It was exactly the kind of situation that humanity had been preparing for without realizing it. MacArthur activated his command frequency and began issuing orders for the next phase of operations. The Zirian system was secure, but there were 42 other worlds that needed liberation. It was going to be the largest humanitarian military operation in galactic history, and humanity was going to lead it whether the other species liked it or not. The Marines who emerged from the smoke over Zirian Prime had proven something that the galaxy was only beginning to understand. Sometimes the best response to overwhelming force was even more overwhelming force applied with surgical precision and absolute commitment. The invaders had picked a fight with the wrong species. Now, they were about to learn what happened when humans decided that someone needed to be stopped. The war room aboard the human flagship Terra's Fury had been designed for operations across human space, conflicts between colonies, and corporate entities that rarely involved more than a few star systems. Now Admiral Rivera found himself staring at a holographic display showing 43 invaded worlds scattered across 3 galactic spiral arms, each one representing a civilization crying out for help that only humanity seemed capable of providing. The intelligence picture that had emerged over the past week was staggering in its implications. The entities they were fighting weren't a conventional military force at all, but something far more sinister. Analysis of captured technology and biological samples had revealed a species that had essentially transformed itself into a living weapon, optimized for one purpose: harvesting other civilizations for biological resources. Dr. Sarah Kim, the expedition's chief xenobiologist, delivered her findings with clinical detachment that barely concealed her horror. "Admiral, we're not dealing with a traditional invasion force. These beings have undergone extensive cybernetic and biological modification to the point where they're barely recognizable as a natural species. Their entire civilization appears to be geared toward consumption of other sentient life forms." Rivera studied the data streams flowing across his displays. Resource extraction patterns, population movement logistics, industrial capacity estimates. The numbers painted a picture of systematic genocide operating on a scale that defied comprehension. "How long have they been at this, Doctor?" "Based on the sophistication of their equipment and the variety of biological samples we've recovered, I'd estimate centuries, possibly millennia. They've refined their methods to an art form. The Xerian Collective wasn't their first victim, and it won't be their last unless we stop them." The Admiral nodded grimly. The rescued Xerian civilians had provided additional intelligence through their testimonies, stories of systematic processing that made his Marines physically ill despite their combat experience. But the interviews had also revealed something crucial. The invaders' operations followed predictable patterns, which meant they could be anticipated and countered. Commander Elena Vasquez, his intelligence officer, highlighted key systems on the tactical display. "Sir, we've identified what appears to be their main staging area. Long-range reconnaissance indicates a massive facility in the Kepler 442 system, approximately 15 jump points from our current position. If we could take that target, it would significantly disrupt their operations across this entire sector." Rivera considered the tactical implications. A strike against the invaders' main base would require committing most of his fleet, leaving the liberated worlds vulnerable to counterattack. But it might also be the only way to end this war before it consumed the entire galaxy. "What's our current force strength?" 12,000 Marines across the expedition force, plus naval personnel. The fleet is at 80% combat effectiveness after the Xerian engagement. However, Vasquez paused, checking her latest reports. "We're receiving offers of assistance from unexpected sources." The commander activated a secondary display showing ship movement patterns across human space. "Admiral, the Galactic Council has formally requested our assistance in dealing with this threat. They're offering full access to their intelligence networks and permission to operate in any system under their protection. More significantly, we're seeing volunteer forces assembling at our forward bases." Rivera raised an eyebrow. "Volunteer forces?" "Human volunteer forces, sir. Word of our operations here has reached civilian networks back home. We're seeing retired military personnel, corporate security forces, even civilian militia units requesting permission to join the campaign. The latest count shows over 50,000 additional personnel ready for deployment within the next 2 weeks." The Admiral felt a familiar mixture of pride and concern. It was exactly the kind of response he would have expected from humanity when faced with this type of atrocity, but managing a force that large would strain their logistics to the breaking point. Still, the math was undeniable. 43 worlds needed liberation, and his current force couldn't be everywhere at once. "Very well. Send word to Terra Central that we're authorizing volunteer deployment under emergency protocols. I want every ship they can spare carrying supplies and equipment for extended operations. This has just become a full-scale military campaign." As his staff began implementing the expanded operation orders, Rivera turned his attention to the immediate tactical situation. The invaders on the remaining occupied worlds would have learned from the defeat at Xerion Prime. They would be adapting their defenses, changing their tactics, possibly even accelerating their harvesting operations before human forces could intervene. The next target had been chosen carefully. The Altair system hosted a confederation of 3 species that had achieved an unusual level of technological integration. Their combined industrial capacity made them valuable to the invaders, but it also meant they had better defenses than the peaceful Xerian collective. If the pattern held, the aliens would have encountered more resistance there. Lieutenant Colonel MacArthur joined the planning session via hologram from his position aboard the assault transport. His Marines had been rotated back to the ships for rest and resupply, but the colonel himself looked like he hadn't slept since the Xerian operation began. "Admiral, my people are ready for immediate deployment. What's the tactical situation at Altair?" Rivera activated the system display, showing long-range sensor data that painted a concerning picture. The good news is that the Altarian Defense Force is still fighting. Long-range communications indicate that approximately 40% of their system defense platforms are still operational. The bad news is that the invaders have had more time to establish their processing infrastructure. The display zoomed in on the primary world, showing heat signatures that indicated massive industrial operations across multiple continents. Intelligence estimates suggest they're processing civilians at nearly triple the rate we observed at Xerion Prime. If we don't reach them within the next 72 hours, there may not be anyone left to rescue. MacArthur studied the tactical data with the practiced eye of someone who had spent his entire adult life planning assaults on hostile positions. "Sir, the defense situation suggests we'll be facing heavier resistance than we encountered at Xerion. The invaders will have had time to adapt to our tactics. I recommend we adjust our approach accordingly." "What do you have in mind, Colonel?" "Full-scale assault with maximum force concentration. Instead of relying on infiltration and surprise, we hit them with everything we have simultaneously. Overwhelm their adaptive capabilities through sheer volume of coordinated attacks." Rivera nadie de provingli. It was exactly the kind of aggressive approach that had made human military doctrine so effective against technologically superior opponents. "Approved. You'll have full naval support and priority access to orbital bombardment assets. Take whatever you need to ensure success." The jump to Altair space took 18 hours, during which human intelligence specialists worked around the clock to refine their target acquisition data. What they found upon arrival exceeded their worst expectations. The invader fleet had grown significantly since Xerion Prime, suggesting they had called in reinforcements from other operations. More ominously, the ships themselves had been modified with what appeared to be captured human technology. "They're learning from us," observed Commander Torres from her position at the tactical station. "Energy signature analysis indicates they've integrated our electronic warfare countermeasures into their defense networks. They're specifically adapting to counter human tactics." Admiral Rivera felt a cold anger settle in his stomach. The enemy wasn't just harvesting civilizations. They were stealing everything that made those civilizations unique and using it to become more effective predators. Then, we'll have to teach them why adapting to human tactics is a mistake. Signal all ships to attack formation. Colonel MacArthur, deploy your Marines. Time to show these bastards that humans are very good at adapting too. The space battle that followed was unlike anything that had occurred at Xerion Prime. The invaders met the human fleet with modified tactics that incorporated lessons learned from their previous defeat. Energy weapons that could punch through human shield configurations, gravitational attacks designed specifically to counter human maneuverability, and coordination protocols that seemed to anticipate human battle plans. For the first hour of combat, it appeared that the invaders might have successfully adapted to human warfare. Their modified ships proved remarkably resilient to human weapons, and their tactical coordination suggested they had developed effective countermeasures to human electronic warfare systems. Then, Admiral Rivera implemented a strategy that no species in galactic history had ever attempted. He ordered his entire fleet to ram the enemy formation at maximum velocity. The tactic was insane by any conventional measure of space warfare. Ships were expensive, crews were irreplaceable, and ramming attacks rarely succeeded against opponents with effective point defense systems. But human military doctrine had been developed by a species that considered suicide attacks a perfectly reasonable tactical option under certain circumstances. The results were devastating. Invader ships that had been modified to counter human weapons and tactics had not been prepared for opponents willing to sacrifice their own vessels to achieve victory. Human ships equipped with reinforced hulls and automated systems crashed through enemy formations like battering rams, their crews evacuating to escape pods moments before impact. In 15 minutes, the invader fleet went from technological superiority to complete tactical disaster. The few ships that survived the ramming attacks found themselves facing human marines who had been launched in assault pods during the confusion, turning what should have been a space battle into boarding actions across multiple vessels. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez led his squad through the corridors of an invader flagship, their powered armor allowing them to operate in sections where life support had been compromised by battle damage. The alien ship's interior was a maze of biological components and cybernetic interfaces that seemed more grown than built, but the tactical principles remained the same. Find the command center and eliminate resistance. The close-quarters combat that followed revealed another adaptation the invaders had made. Their individual soldiers now carried weapons specifically designed to counter human armor, and their tactics had been modified to account for human aggression and mobility. For the first time since the campaign began, human marines found themselves fighting opponents who could match them shot for shot. But matching human marines in close combat was very different from defeating them. Rodriguez's squad adapted to the improved enemy tactics by abandoning tactics entirely. They fought with the kind of savage intensity that had made human soldiers legendary throughout their own history, treating each engagement as a personal vendetta rather than a military objective. The psychological impact on the invaders was immediate and devastating. Their species had optimized itself for efficient predation, but they had never encountered prey that fought back with equal savagery. Human marines who had discovered the horror of the processing facilities didn't just want to win. They wanted revenge for every civilian who had suffered at alien hands. Within hours, the space battle was over and ground operations were beginning across Altair Prime. But this time, the situation on the surface was different. The Altarian Defense Force was still fighting, their resistance having slowed the invader processing operations enough to save significant portions of the civilian population. The Altarians themselves were a revelation to the human forces. Unlike the peaceful Xerian, these beings had maintained military traditions and were equipped with weapons that could actually damage invader technology. Their soldiers fought alongside human marines with a coordination that suggested natural compatibility between human and Altarian tactical doctrines. Captain Lisa Chun found herself working with an Altarian strike team to assault a processing facility that had been built inside what had once been their planetary capital. The aliens stood nearly 3 meters tall and were covered in natural armor that looked like living metal, but they moved with the same aggressive precision that characterized human infantry. Their tactics are similar to ours, observed Sergeant Major Kowalski as he watched the Altarians coordinate their assault. Same emphasis on speed and violence of action. They understand fire and movement. The joint assault on the facility became a textbook example of combined arms operations. Human Marines provided electronic warfare support and heavy weapons, while Altarian forces used their natural advantages in size and strength to breach enemy positions. The integration was so seamless that observers would later have difficulty determining which species had contributed what to the victory. But the real revelation came when the combined forces reached the processing centers and discovered that the Altarians had been fighting to rescue not just their own people, but representatives from a dozen other species that had been brought to their world for processing. The invaders were using Altair Prime as a central collection point for biological resources harvested from across multiple star systems. The scope of the operation was staggering. Storage facilities contained biological materials from species that hadn't been seen in galactic communication networks for decades. processing equipment designed to handle dozens of different physiologies simultaneously. Transportation systems that could move thousands of beings across interstellar distances without regard for their survival needs. Dr. Kim's analysis of the facility revealed the true scope of what humanity was fighting. Admiral, this isn't just genocide. It's systematic extinction of any species that possesses useful biological traits. They're harvesting entire civilizations and using the genetic material to enhance their own capabilities. The discovery changed the strategic situation completely. This wasn't a war between competing civilizations. It was a battle for the survival of biological diversity in the galaxy. The invaders weren't content to conquer. They wanted to absorb every useful trait from every species they encountered, turning themselves into the ultimate predator. Admiral Rivera looked at the intelligence reports and felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Humanity had stumbled into a conflict that would determine the fate of every sentient species in the galaxy. The peaceful civilizations that had criticized human militarism for centuries now depended entirely on human willingness to fight for people they had never met. Signal Terra Central, he ordered. Tell them we need everything they can send. Ships, Marines, supplies, volunteers. Everything. We're not just fighting for the Xerian Collective or the Altarian Confederation anymore. We're fighting for the right of any species to exist without being harvested. As reports came in from other liberation operations across the galaxy, the scope of human commitment became clear. Volunteer forces were arriving at the rate of thousands per day. Civilian corporations were converting their entire production capacity to military supplies, and human colonies were emptying their defense forces to contribute to the campaign. It was the largest military mobilization in human history, dedicated not to conquering territory or securing resources, but to protecting species they had never encountered from an enemy that threatened the very concept of biological diversity. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when humanity decided that something was worth fighting for. The invaders had made one critical error in their assessment of human capabilities. They had adapted to human tactics and technology, but they had never encountered human determination when fighting for others. That oversight was about to cost them everything they had built over millennia of systematic predation. The war was expanding beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen, and at its center were human Marines who had emerged from smoke and fire to answer a plea for help from strangers. They had come to save one world and discovered they needed to save them all. The approach to the Kepler 442 system required careful coordination between the largest military fleet humanity had ever assembled and intelligence networks spanning half the galaxy. Admiral Rivera stood before a holographic display showing the culmination of 6 months of the most brutal warfare in galactic history. Nearly 200 human ships carrying 50,000 Marines and support personnel, accompanied by volunteer forces from 12 liberated species, all converging on the source of a nightmare that had consumed civilizations for millennia. The enemy stronghold that awaited them defied conventional description. Long-range reconnaissance had revealed a construct that appeared to be part space station, part living organism, and part industrial complex. It stretched across an area larger than most planets, its biomechanical structures pulsing with energy signatures that suggested it was processing biological materials on an unimaginable scale. Dr. Sarah Kim's final intelligence briefing painted a picture that made even hardened Marines uncomfortable. Admiral, we're looking at what appears to be the central hub for their entire harvesting operation. Conservative estimates suggest they're processing biological materials from over 1,000 different species simultaneously. The facility appears to be self-modifying, incorporating useful traits from each harvested population into its own structure. Rivera studied the tactical display, noting defensive positions that incorporated technology from dozens of conquered civilizations. Energy shields based on Xerian crystalline matrices, gravitational weapons derived from Altarian physics, and sensor networks that seemed to integrate capabilities from every species the invaders had encountered. "They've been building this facility for centuries," observed Commander Vasquez. "Every civilization they've harvested has contributed something to its capabilities. It's not just their headquarters. It's a repository for everything they've stolen." Lieutenant Colonel MacArthur joined the briefing via secure link from the assault transport, carrying his expanded Marine division. The past 6 months had transformed his force from a standard expeditionary unit into something unprecedented. A combined arms formation incorporating human Marines, Altarian heavy assault specialists, Xerian technical experts, and volunteers from 10 other liberated species. "Admiral, my assessment is that conventional assault tactics won't be sufficient against a target this large and well-defended. We're going to need to coordinate simultaneous attacks across multiple vectors while maintaining the element of surprise. I recommend we use the diversity of our combined force as an advantage." The plan that emerged from the tactical conference was ambitious even by human standards. Rather than attempting to destroy the facility outright, the combined fleet would assault it from multiple directions simultaneously, using the unique capabilities of each species to overcome specific defensive systems. Human Marines would handle electronic warfare and urban combat. Altarian forces would breach heavy fortifications, Xerian specialists would disable technical systems, and volunteers from other species would contribute their own unique advantages. But the real innovation was strategic rather than tactical. Instead of simply destroying the facility, they would attempt to capture it intact and use the invaders' own accumulated knowledge against them. The biological repository that had taken millennia to assemble would become a resource for restoring the species that had been harvested. The approach to the Kepler 442 system revealed the true scope of what they were facing. The invader construct wasn't alone. It was surrounded by hundreds of support vessels, defensive platforms, and what appeared to be biological entities the size of small moons. The entire system had been transformed into a fortress protecting the greatest collection of stolen life in galactic history. Admiral Rivera felt the weight of command as he prepared to order the largest battle in human history against an enemy that had been perfecting warfare for millennia. But he also felt something else: absolute confidence in the beings under his command. Human Marines had proven themselves capable of fighting impossible odds, and their alien allies had shown the same determination to reclaim what had been stolen from their civilizations. "All units, this is Admiral Rivera. 6 months ago, a peaceful species asked for our help against an enemy they couldn't fight. Today, we're here with representatives from 12 liberated worlds to end this threat once and for all. The facility ahead of us contains the stolen heritage of over 1,000 civilizations. We're not just fighting to destroy it. We're fighting to give those civilizations back their future." The battle began with a coordinated strike against the facility's outer defenses. Human ships equipped with ramming charges crashed through energy barriers that had been thought impenetrable, while Altarian vessels used gravitational manipulation to create breaches in the facility's biomechanical hull. Xerian technical specialists, operating from specially modified ships, began systematic infiltration of the enemy's control networks. The response from the facility was immediate and devastating. Weapons systems that incorporated technology from 1,000 conquered species opened fire with energy signatures that made space itself seem to burn. Defensive drones the size of human destroyers emerged from hidden bays, their hulls incorporating armor technologies that had been harvested from civilizations across the galaxy. But the combined fleet had advantages that no previous opponents had possessed. Each species contributed tactical capabilities that the facility's designers had never encountered in combination. Human electronic warfare systems working in coordination with Altarian gravitational manipulators and Xerian crystalline resonance weapons created attack patterns that the facility's adaptive defenses couldn't counter effectively. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez led a mixed assault team through corridors that seemed to shift and change as they advanced. The facility's interior was a living maze of biological and mechanical components that responded to the presence of intruders by modifying itself in real time. But Rodriguez's team included Xerian specialists who understood biological computing systems and Altaria engineers who could manipulate gravitational fields to prevent the facility from reconfiguring itself. The combination proved devastatingly effective. Where human Marines provided aggressive assault capabilities, their alien allies contributed technical expertise that allowed them to understand and counter the facility's defensive adaptations. The teamwork that had developed over months of joint operations meant that mixed-species teams functioned with an efficiency that surprised even their commanders. Captain Chun found herself leading a rescue operation through what appeared to be storage areas containing living representatives from hundreds of species. The facility hadn't just been harvesting biological materials. It had been maintaining breeding populations to ensure continued access to useful genetic resources. The scope of the captive populations was staggering, representing species that most of the galaxy had assumed were extinct. But rescuing the captives required more than just opening containment systems. Many of the beings had been held for years, or even decades, subjected to procedures that had left them in various states of physical and psychological trauma. Medical teams from multiple species worked together to provide care that accounted for dozens of different physiologies and psychological frameworks. Dr. Kim coordinated the medical response while also analyzing the facility's biological processing systems. What she discovered exceeded her worst fears and greatest hopes simultaneously. The facility contains active biological samples from over 1,500 species, many of which we thought were extinct. But they've also been using those samples to create hybrid organisms designed for specific purposes. The implications were staggering. The invaders hadn't just been harvesting civilizations. They had been using the biological diversity of the entire galaxy as raw material for creating specialized organisms. Biological computers using neural tissue from telepathic species, living weapons incorporating predator genetics from apex species, and adaptive armor systems based on the defensive capabilities of the most resilient life forms in known space. Admiral Rivera received reports from across the facility as assault teams discovered the full scope of what they were fighting. "Sir, we found what appears to be the central processing core. It's not just a computer system. It's a living entity incorporating neural tissue from hundreds of sapient species. The facility itself appears to be at least partially sentient." The revelation changed the nature of the battle completely. They weren't just fighting an installation. They were fighting a creature that had been constructed from the stolen consciousness of entire civilizations. The facility's adaptive defenses weren't just technological responses. They were the reactions of a composite entity that incorporated the survival instincts of every species it had absorbed. Lieutenant Colonel MacArthur coordinated the final assault against the central core, leading a mixed force that represented every liberated species in the coalition. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone involved. Beings whose civilizations had been harvested to create this monstrosity were working together to destroy it and reclaim what had been stolen. The central core chamber defied description. Biological processing systems stretched across a space that could have contained a small city, their surfaces pulsing with energy that seemed to contain the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 civilizations. At the center of it all was something that might once have been the original invader species, now so modified by incorporated biological materials that it was barely recognizable as having evolved naturally. The entity that emerged from the central processing systems was a composite creature incorporating the most dangerous characteristics from every species it had harvested. It possessed Altarian gravitational manipulation capabilities, Xerian crystalline defense systems, human adaptability and aggression, and traits from dozens of other species that had been absorbed over millennia. The battle that followed was unlike anything in the history of warfare. Human Marines, working in coordination with beings whose own genetic material had been incorporated into their opponent, fighting to destroy a creature that represented the ultimate violation of biological autonomy. Every shot fired, Every tactical decision made carried the weight of over 1,000 extinct civilizations crying out for justice. Sergeant Rodriguez found himself fighting alongside a Xerian technical specialist whose own people's neural patterns had been incorporated into the facility's control systems. "Can you shut it down?" he asked as they took cover behind crystalline formations that seemed to pulse with familiar energy signatures. "Not shut it down," the Xerian replied, her four arms working frantically with control interfaces that seemed to recognize her genetic patterns. "But I could get it back what it stole. Every consciousness it absorbed, every memory it harvested, all of it can be returned to their original patterns." The implications hit Rodriguez immediately. They weren't just fighting to destroy the facility. They were fighting to resurrect every civilization that had been consumed. "Do it," he said, laying down, covering fire as the Xerian specialist worked to reverse millennia of systematic absorption. Across the facility, similar scenes played out as representatives from each liberated species worked to reclaim their people's stolen heritage. Altarian engineers restored gravitational manipulation technology that had been corrupted for harvest operations. Human technical specialists rebuilt electronic systems that had been perverted into processing networks. Volunteers from dozen other species contributed their unique capabilities to the massive undertaking of undoing centuries of systematic destruction. The composite entity at the facility's core fought desperately against the reversal process, its hybrid consciousness recognizing that success would mean the end of everything it had built. But it was fighting against the combined will of every civilization it had tried to erase, channeled through beings who understood that this battle was about more than military victory. Dr. Kim monitored the biological restoration process from her position aboard the command ship, watching as stolen genetic patterns were separated from their corrupted applications and returned to their original configurations. "Admiral, we're seeing spontaneous regeneration of entire species' genetic matrices. The facility's biological computers are literally giving birth to populations that were thought extinct." The final phase of the battle wasn't fought with weapons, but with the accumulated scientific knowledge of every species in the coalition. Human medical technology, Altarian physics, Xerian biology, and techniques from dozens of other civilizations were combined in an effort to restore what had been thought permanently lost. As the facility's central systems completed their transformation from processing center to restoration matrix, the composite entity that had been its controlling intelligence began to dissolve. But rather than dying, it was separating back into its component consciousnesses, each one returning to the genetic patterns from which it had been stolen. The final moment came when the last harvested consciousness was returned to its original configuration, breaking the neural links that had held the facility together. The massive construct that had taken millennia to build began to transform itself, its biological components reorganizing into habitation systems designed to support the resurrection of over 1,000 extinct species. Admiral Rivera watched from the command deck as one of the greatest crimes in galactic history was reversed through the combined efforts of beings who had refused to accept that extinction was permanent. Representatives from species that had been thought lost forever were emerging from restoration matrices, their genetic patterns rebuilt from stolen samples that had been preserved in the facility's biological archives. The war was over, but the real work was just beginning. Over 1,000 species needed to be reintroduced to worlds that could support them, their civilizations rebuilt from genetic memory and cultural fragments that had been preserved in the facility's databases. The coalition that had formed to fight the invaders would need to transform itself into something unprecedented, a galactic restoration project. Kethlar stood in the observation deck of the converted facility, watching as beings emerged from restoration chambers with the genetic memories of civilizations that had been extinct for centuries. Her own people were among them, Xerian who had been harvested decades ago, and whose patterns had been preserved in the facility's biological archives. "Your species kept their promise," she said to Admiral Rivera as he joined her at the observation window. "You came to help when we asked, and you didn't stop until everyone was saved." Rivera nodded, watching as human Marines worked alongside representatives from dozens of species to coordinate the most complex humanitarian operation in galactic history. It's what we do. Someone asks for help, we give it, even if it takes us places we never expected to go. The final reports from across the Coalition fleet showed the true scope of what had been accomplished. Not just the defeat of an enemy that had threatened the entire galaxy, but the resurrection of civilizations that had been thought lost forever. The diversity that the invaders had tried to harvest and control had become the foundation for rebuilding everything they had tried to destroy. The human Marines who had emerged from the smoke over Zirian Prime 6 months ago had answered a simple plea for help and discovered that sometimes helping one species means saving them all. The galaxy would remember that when peaceful beings were threatened by those who would consume them, there were others willing to fight to preserve the right to exist. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't military, it was biological. The invaders had tried to steal the genetic heritage of the galaxy and had instead created the means for its restoration. Every species they had harvested was reborn, their civilizations given a second chance to flourish in a galaxy where diversity was protected by beings who understood that some things were worth fighting for. The smoke had cleared, the battles were over, and from the ruins of the greatest threat in galactic history came the seeds of the most diverse and protected civilization the galaxy had ever seen. The aliens had pleaded for help, and humanity had answered with something greater than military victory. The promise that no species would ever again face extinction alone.